The Maker of Gargoyles by Clark Ashton Smith. Among the many gargoyles that frowned or leered from the roof of the new-built cathedral of Vyônes, two were preeminent above the rest by virtue of their fine workmanship and their supreme grotesquerie. These two had been wrought by the stone-carver Blaise Reynard, a native of Vyônes, who had lately returned from a long sojourn in the cities of Provence, and had secured employment on the cathedral when the 3 years' task of its construction and ornamentation was well nigh completed. In the view of the wonderful artistry shown by Reynard, it was regretted by Ambrosius, the archbishop, that it had not been possible to commit the execution of all the gargoyles to this delicate and accomplished workman. But other people, with less liberal tastes than Ambrosius, were heard to express a different opinion. This opinion, perhaps, was tinged by the personal dislike that had been generally felt toward Reynard in Vyônes even from his boyhood, and which had been revived with some virulence on his return. Whether rightly or unjustly, his very physiognomy had always marked him out for public disfavor. He was inordinately dark, with hair and beard of a preternatural bluish-black, and slanting, ill-matched eyes that gave him a sinister and cunning air. His taciturn and saturnine ways were such as a superstitious people would identify with necromantic knowledge or complicity, and there were those who covertly accused him of being in league with Satan, though the accusations were little more than vague, anonymous rumors, even to the end, through lack of veritable evidence. However, the people who suspected Reynard of diabolical affiliations were wont for a while to instance the two gargoyles as sufficient proof. No man, they contended, who was so inspired by the arch-enemy could have carven anything so sheerly evil and malignant, could have embodied so consummately in mere stone the living lineaments of the most demoniacal of all the deadly sins. The two gargoyles were perched on opposite corners of a high tower of the cathedral. One was a snarling, murderous cat-headed monster, with retracted lips revealing formidable fangs, and eyes that glared intolerable hatred from beneath ferine brows. This creature had the claws and wings of a griffin, and seemed as if it were poised in readiness to swoop down on the city of Vyônes, like a harpy on its prey. Its companion was a horned satyr, with the vans of some great bat, such as might roam the nether caverns, with sharp, clenching talons, and a look of satanically brooding lust, as if it were gloating above the helpless object of its unclean desire. Both figures were complete, even to the hindquarters, and were not mere conventional adjuncts of the roof. One would have expected them to start at any moment from the stone in which they were mortised. Ambrosius, a lover of art, had been openly delighted with these creations because of their high technical merit and their verisimilitude as works of sculpture. But others, including many humbler dignitaries of the church, were more or less scandalized, and said that the workman had informed these figures with a visible likeness of his own vices, to the glory of Belial rather than of God, and had thus perpetrated a sort of blasphemy. Of course, they admitted, a certain amount of grotesquerie was requisite in gargoyles, but in this case the allowable bounds had been egregiously overpassed. However, With the completion of the cathedral, and in spite of all this adverse criticism, the high-poised gargoyles of Blaise Reynard, like all other details of the building, were soon taken for granted through mere everyday familiarity, and eventually they were almost forgotten. The scandal of opposition died down, and the stone-carver himself, though the townfolk continued to eye him askance, was able to secure other work through the favor of discriminating patrons. He remained in Vyônes and paid his addresses, albeit without visible success, to a taverner's daughter, one Nicolette Vyônes, of whom, it was said, he had long been enamored in his own surly and reticent fashion. But Reynard himself had not forgotten the gargoyles. Often, in passing the superb pile of the cathedral, he would gaze up at them with a secret satisfaction whose cause he could hardly have assigned or delimited. They seemed to retain for him a rare and mystical meaning, to signalize an obscure but pleasurable triumph. He would have said, if asked for the reason for his satisfaction, that he was proud of a skillful piece of handiwork. He would not have said, and perhaps would not even have known, that in one of the gargoyles he had imprisoned all his festering rancor, all his answering spleen and hatred toward the people of Vyônes, who had always hated him, and had set the image of this rancor to peer venomously down forever from a lofty place. And perhaps he would not even have dreamt that in the second gargoyle he had somehow expressed his own dour and satyr-like passion for the girl Nicolette, a passion that had brought him back to the detested city of his youth after years of wandering, a passion singularly tenacious of one object, and differing in this regard from the ordinary lusts of a nature so brutal as Reynard's. Always to the stonecutter, even more than to those who had criticized and abhorred his productions, the gargoyles were alive. They possessed a vitality and a sentiency of their own. And most of all did they seem to live when the summer drew to an end and the autumn rains had gathered upon Vyônes. Then, when the full cathedral gutters poured above the streets, one might have thought that the actual spittle of a foul malevolence, the very slaver of an impure lust, had somehow been mingled with the water that ran in rills from the mouths of the gargoyles. At that time, in the year of our Lord 1138, Vyônes was the principal town of the province of Averoigne. On two sides the great shadow-haunted forest, a place of equivocal legends, of loup-garou and phantoms, approached to the very walls and flung its umbrage upon them at early forenoon and evening. On the other sides there lay cultivated fields and gentle streams that meandered among willows or poplars, and roads that ran through an open plain to the high chateaux of noble lords and to regions beyond Averoigne. The town itself was prosperous, and had never shared in the ill fame of the bordering forest. It had long been sanctified by the presence of two nunneries and a monastery. And now, with the completion of the long-planned cathedral, it was thought that Vyônes would have henceforward the additional protection of a more august holiness, that demon and strige and incubus would keep their distance from its heaven-favored purlieus with a more meticulous caution than before. Of course, as in all medieval towns, there had been occasional instances of alleged sorcery or demoniacal possession, and once or twice, the perilous temptations of succubi had made their inroads in the pious virtue of Vyônes. But this was nothing more than might be expected, in a world where the devil and his works were always more or less rampant. No one could possibly have anticipated the reign of infernal horrors that was to make hideous the latter months of autumn following the cathedral's erection. To make the matter even more inexplicable and more blasphemously dreadful than it would otherwise have been, the first of these horrors occurred in the neighborhood of the cathedral itself, and almost beneath its sheltering shadow. Two men, a respectable clothier named Guillaume Maspierre and an equally reputable cooper, one Jérôme Mazal, were returning to their lodgings in the late hours of a November eve after imbibing both the red and white wines of the countryside in more than one tavern. According to Maspierre, who alone survived to tell the tale, they were passing along a street that skirted the cathedral square and could see the bulk of the great building against the stars, when a flying monster, black as the soot of Abaddon, had descended upon them from the heavens and assailed Jérôme Mazal, beating him down with its heavily flapping wings and seizing him with its inch-long teeth and talons. Maspierre was unable to describe the creature with minuteness, for he had seen it but dimly and partially in the unlit street. And moreover, the fate of his companion, who had fallen to the cobblestones with the black devil snarling and tearing at his throat, had not induced Maspierre to linger in that vicinity. He had betaken himself from the scene with all the celerity of which he was capable, and had stopped only at the house of a priest many streets away, where he had related his adventure between shudderings and hiccupings. Armed with holy water and aspergillus, and accompanied by many of the townspeople carrying torches, staves and halberds, the priest was led by Maspierre to the place of the horror, and there they had found the body of Mazal, with fearfully mangled face and throat and bosom lined with bloody lacerations. The demoniac assailant had flown, and it was not seen or encountered again that night. But those who had beheld its work were turned aghast to their homes, feeling that a creature of nethermost hell had come to visit the city, and perchance to abide therein. Consternation was rife on the morrow when the story became generally known, and rites of exorcism against the invading demon were performed by the clergy in all public places and before thresholds. But the sprinkling of holy water and the mumbling of the stated forms were futile, for the evil spirit was still abroad, and its malignity was proved once more on the night following the ghastly death of Jérôme Mazal. This time, it claimed 2 victims, burghers of high probity and some consequence, on whom it descended in a narrow alley, slaying one of them instantaneously and dragging down the other from behind as he sought to flee. The shrill cries of the helpless men and the guttural growling of the demon were heard by people in the houses along the alley, and some, who were hardy enough to peer from their windows, had seen the departure of the infamous assailant blotting out the autumn stars with the sable and misshapen foulness of its wings, and hovering in inexorable menace above the housetops. After this, few people would venture abroad at night, unless in case of dire and exigent need, and those who did venture went in armed companies and were all furnished with flambeaux, thinking thus to frighten away the demon, which they adjudged a creature of darkness that would abhor the light and shrink therefrom, through the nature of its kind. But the boldness of this fiend was beyond measure, for it proceeded to attack more than one company of worthy citizens, disregarding the flaring torches that were thrust in its face, or putting them out with stenchful wind of its wide vans. Evidently, it was a spirit of homicidal hate, for all the people on whom it seized were grievously mangled or torn to numberless shreds by its teeth and talons. Those who saw it, and survived, were wont to describe it variously and with much ambiguity, but all agreed in attributing to it the head of a ferocious animal and the wings of a monstrous bird. Some, the most learned in demonology, were fain to identify it with Modo, the spirit of murder, and others took it for one of the great lieutenants of Satan, perhaps a Mammon or Alastor, gone mad with exasperation at the impregnable supremacy of Christ in the holy city of Vyônes. The terror that soon prevailed beneath the widening scope of these satanical incursions and depredations was beyond all belief. A clotted, seething, devil-ridden gloom of superstitious obsession, not to be hinted at in modern language. Even by daylight, the gothic wings of nightmare seemed to brood in underparting oppression above the city, and fear was everywhere, like the foul contagion of some epidemic plague. The inhabitants went their way in prayer and trembling, and the archbishop himself, as well as the subordinate clergy, confessed an inability to cope with the ever-growing horror. An emissary was sent to Rome to procure water that had been specially sanctified by the Pope. This alone, it was thought, would be efficient enough to drive away the dreadful visitant. In the meantime, the horror waxed and mounted to its culmination. One eve, toward the middle of November, the abbot of the local monastery of Cordelier, who had gone forth to administer extreme unction to a dying friend, was seized by the black devil just as he approached the threshold of his destination, and was slain in the same atrocious manner as the other victims. To this doubly infamous deed, a scarce believable blasphemy was soon added. On the very next night, while the torn body of the abbot lay on a rich catafalque in the cathedral, and masses were being said and tapers burned, the demon invaded the high nave through the open door, extinguished all the candles with one flap of its sooty wings, and dragged down no less than 3 of the officiating priests to an unholy death in the darkness. Everyone now felt that a truly formidable assault was being made by the powers of evil on the Christian property of Vyônes. In the condition of abject terror, of extreme disorder and demoralization that followed upon this new atrocity, there was a deplorable outbreak of human crime, of murder and rapine and thievery, together with covert manifestations of Satanism and celebrations of the Black Mass attended by many neophytes. Then, in the midst of all this pandemoniacal fear and confusion, it was rumored that a second devil had been seen in Vyônes, that the murderous fiend was accompanied by a spirit of equal deformity and darkness, whose intentions were those of lechery, and which molested none but women. This creature had frightened several dames and demoiselles and maidservants into a veritable hysteria by peering through their bedroom windows, and had sidled lasciviously with uncouth mows and grimaces, and grotesque flappings of its bat-shaped wings, towards others who had occasion to fare from house to house across the nocturnal streets. However, strange to say, there were no authentic instances in which the chastity of any woman had suffered actual harm from this noisome incubus. Many were approached by it, and were terrified immoderately by the hideousness and lustfulness of its demeanor, but no one was ever touched. Even in that time of horror, both spiritual and corporeal, there were those who made a ribald jest of this singular abstention on the part of the demon, and said it was seeking throughout Vyônes for someone whom it had not yet found. The lodgings of Blaise Reynard were separated only by the length of a dark and crooked alley from the tavern kept by Jean Vyônes, the father of Nicolette. In this tavern, Reynard had been wont to spend his evenings, though his suit was frowned upon by Jean Vyônes, and had received but scant encouragement from the girl herself. However, because of his well-filled purse and his almost illimitable capacity for wine, Reynard was tolerated. He came early each night, with the falling of darkness, and would sit in silence hour after hour, staring with hot and sullen eyes at Nicolette, and gulping joylessly the potent vintages of Averoigne. Apart from their desire to retain his custom, the people of the tavern were a little afraid of him, on account of his dubious and semi-sorcerous reputation, and also because of his surly temper. They did not wish to antagonize him more than was necessary. Like everyone else in Vyônes, Reynard had felt a suffocating burden of superstitious terror during those nights when the fiendish marauder was hovering above the town and might descend on the luckless wayfarer at any moment, in any locality. Nothing less urgent and imperative than the obsession of his half-bestial longing for Nicolette could have induced him to traverse after dark the length of the winding alley to the tavern door. The autumn nights had been moonless. Now, on the evening that followed the desecration of the cathedral itself by the murderous devil, a newborn crescent was lowering its fragile, sanguine-colored horn beyond the housetops as Reynard went forth from his lodgings at the accustomed hour. He lost sight of its comforting beam in the high-walled and narrow alley, and shivered with dread as he hastened onward through shadows that were dissipated only by the rare and timid ray from some lofty window. It seemed to him, at each turn and angle, that the gloom was curdled by the unclean umbrage of satanic wings, and might reveal in another instant the gleaming of abhorrent eyes ignited by the everlasting coals of the pit. When he came forth at the alley's end, he saw with a start of fresh panic that the crescent moon was blotted out by a cloud that had a semblance of uncouthly arched and pointed vans. He reached the tavern with a sense of supreme relief, for he had begun to feel a distinct intuition that someone, or something, was following him, unheard and invisible, a presence that seemed to load the dusk with prodigious menace. He entered and closed the door behind him very quickly, as if he were shutting it in the face of a dread pursuer. There were few people in the tavern that evening. The girl Nicolette was serving wine to a mercer's assistant, one Raoul Coupin, a personable youth and a newcomer in the neighborhood, and she was laughing with what Reynard considered unseemly gaiety at the broad jests and amorous sallies of this Raoul. Jean Vyônes was discussing in a low voice the latest enormities and was drinking fully as much liquor as his customers. Glowering with jealousy at the presence of Raoul Coupin, whom he suspected of being a favored rival, Reynard seated himself in silence and stared malignly at the flirtatious couple. No one seemed to have noticed his entrance, for Vyônes went on talking to his cronies without pause or interruption, and Nicolette and her companion were equally oblivious. To his jealous rage, Reynard soon added the resentment of one who feels that he is being deliberately ignored. He began to pound on the table with his heavy fists to attract attention. Vyônes, who had been sitting all the while his back turned, now called out to Nicolette without even troubling to face around on his stool, telling her to serve Reynard. Giving a backward smile at Coupin, she came slowly and with open reluctance to the stone-carver's table. She was small and buxom, with reddish gold hair that curled luxuriantly above the short, delicious oval of her face, and she was gowned in a tight-fitting dress of apple green that revealed the firm, seductive outlines of her hips and bosom. Her air was disdainful and a little cold, for she did not like Reynard and had taken small pains at any time to conceal her aversion. But to Reynard she was lovelier and more desirable than ever, and he felt a savage impulse to seize her in his arms and carry her bodily away from the tavern before the eyes of Raoul Coupin and her father. "Bring me a pitcher of Lafreniere," he ordered gruffly, in a voice that betrayed his mingled resentment and desire. Tossing her head lightly and scornfully, with more glances at Coupin, the girl obeyed. She placed the fiery, blood-dark wine before Reynard without speaking, and then went back to resume her bantering with the mercer's assistant. Reynard began to drink, and the potent vintage merely served to inflame his smouldering enmity and passion. His eyes became venomous, his curling lips malignant as those of the gargoyles he had carved on the new cathedral. A baleful, primordial anger, like the rage of some morose and thwarted faun, burned within him with a slow red fire. But he strove to repress it, and sat silent and motionless, except for the frequent filling and emptying of his wine cup. Raoul Coupin had also consumed a liberal quantity of wine. As a result, he soon became bolder in his love-making, and strove to kiss the hand of Nicolette, who had now seated herself on the bench beside him. The hand was playfully withheld, and then, after its owner had cuffed Raoul very lightly and briskly, was granted to the claimant in a fashion that struck Reynard as being no less than wanton. Snarling inarticulately, with a mad impulse to rush forward and slay the successful rival with his bare hands, he started to his feet and stepped toward the playful pair. His movement was noted by one of the men in the far corner, who spoke warningly to Vyônes. The tavern keeper arose, lurching a little from his potations, and came warily across the room with his eyes on Reynard, ready to interfere in case of violence. Reynard paused with a momentary irresolution, and then went on, half insane with a mounting hatred for them all. He longed to kill Vyônes and Coupin, to kill the hateful cronies who sat staring from the corner, and then, above their throttled corpses, to ravage with fierce kisses and vehement caresses the shrinking lips and body of Nicolette. Seeing the approach of the stone-carver, and knowing his evil temper and dark jealousy, Coupin also rose to his feet and plucked stealthily beneath his cloak at the hilt of a little dagger which he carried. In the meanwhile, Jean Vyônes had interposed his burly bulk between the rivals. For the sake of the tavern's good repute, he wished to prevent the possible brawl. "Back to your table, stonecutter!" he roared belligerently at Reynard. Being unarmed and seeing himself outnumbered, Reynard paused again, though his anger still simmered within him like the contents of a sorcerer's cauldron. With ruddy points of murderous flame in his hollow, slitted eyes, He glared at the three people before him, and saw beyond them, with instinctive rather than conscious awareness, the leaded panes of the tavern window, in whose glass the room was dimly reflected with its glowing tapers, its glimmering tableware, the heads of Coupin and Vyônes and the girl Nicolette, and his own shadowy face among them. Strangely, and it would seem inconsequently, he remembered at that moment the dark, ambiguous cloud he had seen across the moon, and the insistent feeling of obscure pursuit while he had traversed the alley. Then, as he still gazed irresolutely at the group before him, and its vague reflection in the glass beyond, there came a thunderous crash, and the panes of the window with their pictured scene were shattered inward in a score of fragments. Ere the litter of falling glass had reached the tavern floor, a swart and monstrous form flew into the room, with a beating of heavy vans that caused the tapers to flare troublously, and the shadows to dance like a sabbat of misshapen devils. The thing hovered for a moment, and seemed to tower in a great darkness higher than the ceiling above the heads of Reynard and the others as they turned toward it. They saw the malignant burning of its eyes, like coals in the depths of a Tartarian pit, and the curling of its hateful lips on the bared teeth that were longer and sharper than serpent fangs. Behind it now, another shadowy flying monster came in through the broken window with a loud flapping of its ribbed and pointed wings. There was something lascivious in the very motion of its flight, even as homicidal hatred and malignity were manifest in the flight of the other. Its satyr-like face was twisted in a horrible, never-changing leer, and its lustful eyes were fixed on Nicolette as it hung in air beside the first intruder. Reynard, as well as the other men, was petrified by a feeling of astonishment and consternation so extreme as almost to preclude terror. Voiceless and motionless, they beheld the demoniac intrusion, and the consternation of Reynard in particular was mingled with an element of unspeakable surprise, together with a dreadful recognizance. But the girl Nicolette, with a mad scream of horror, turned and started to flee across the room. As if her cry had been the one provocation needed, the two demons swooped upon their victims. One, with a ferocious slash of its outstretched claws, tore open the throat of Jean Vyônes, who fell with a gurgling, blood-choked groan. And then, in the same fashion, it assailed Raoul Coupin. The other, in the meanwhile, had pursued and overtaken the fleeing girl, and had seized her in his bestial forearms, with the ribbed wings enfolding her like a hellish drapery. The room was filled by a moaning whirlwind, by a chaos of wild cries and tossing, struggling shadows. Reynard heard the guttural snarling of the murderous monster, muffled by the body of Coupin, whom it was tearing with its teeth, and he heard the lubricous laughter of the incubus, above the shrieks of the hysterically frightened girl. Then the grotesquely flaring tapers went out in a gust of swirling air, and Reynard received a violent blow in the darkness, the blow of some rushing object, perhaps of a passing wing, that was hard and heavy as stone. He fell and became insensible. Dully and confusedly, with much effort, Reynard struggled back to consciousness. For a brief interim, he could not remember where he was, nor what had happened. He was troubled by the painful throbbing of his head, by the humming of agitated voices about him, by the glaring of many lights, and the thronging of many faces when he opened his eyes. And above all, by the sense of nameless but grievous calamity and uttermost horror that weighed him down from the first dawning of sentiency. Memory returned to him, laggard and reluctant, and with it, a full awareness of his surroundings and situation. He was lying on the tavern floor, and his own warm, sticky blood was rilling across his face from the wound on his aching head. The long room was half filled with people of the neighborhood, bearing torches and knives and halberds, who had entered and were peering at the corpses of Vyônes and Coupin, which lay amid pools of wine-diluted blood and the wreckage of the shattered furniture and tableware. Nicolette, with her green gown in shreds and her body crushed by the embraces of the demon, was moaning feebly while women crowded about her with ineffectual cries and questions which he could not even hear or understand. The two cronies of Vyônes, horribly clawed and mangled, were dead beside her overturned table. Stupefied with horror, and still dizzy from the blow that had laid him unconscious, Reynard staggered to his feet and found himself surrounded at once by inquiring faces and voices. Some of the people were a little suspicious of him, since he was the sole survivor in the tavern and bore an ill repute. But his replies to their questions soon convinced them that the new crime was wholly the work of the same demons that had plagued Vyônes in so monstrous a fashion for weeks past. Reynard, however, was unable to tell them all that he had seen, or to confess the ultimate sources of his fear and stupefaction, the secret of that which he knew was locked in the seething pit of his tortured and devil-ridden soul. Somehow he left the ravaged inn. He pushed his way through the gathering crowd with its terror-muted murmurs, and found himself alone on the midnight streets. Heedless of his own possible peril, and scarcely knowing where he went, he wandered through Vyônes for many hours, and some while in his wanderings, he came to his own workshop. With no assignable reason for the act, he entered, and re-emerged with a heavy hammer, which he carried with him during his subsequent peregrinations. Then, driven by his awful and unremissive torture, he went on till the pale dawn had touched the spires and the housetops with a ghostly glimmering. By a half-conscious compulsion, his steps had led him to the square before the cathedral. Ignoring the amazed verger, who had just opened the doors, he entered and sought a stairway that wound tortuously upward to the tower on which his own gargoyles were ensconced. In the chill and livid light of sunless morning, he emerged on the roof, and leaning perilously from the verge, he examined the carven figures. He felt no surprise, only the hideous confirmation of a fear too ghastly to be named, when he saw that the teeth and claws of the malign, cat-headed griffin were stained with darkening blood, and that shreds of apple-green cloth were hanging from the talons of the lustful, bat-winged satyr. It seemed to Reynard, in the dim ashen light, that a look of unspeakable triumph, of intolerable irony, was imprinted on the face of this latter creature. He stared at it with fearful and agonizing fascination, while impotent rage, abhorrence and repentance deeper than that of the damned arose within him in a smothering flood. He was hardly aware that he had raised the iron hammer and had struck wildly at the satyr's horned profile, till he heard the sullen, angry clang of impact, and found that he was tottering on the edge of the roof to retain his balance. The furious blow had merely chipped the features of the gargoyle, and had not wiped away the malignant lust and exultation. Again, Reynard raised the heavy hammer. It fell on empty air, for even as he struck, the stone-carver felt himself lifted and drawn backward by something that sank into his flesh like many separate knives. He staggered helplessly, His feet slipped, and then he was lying on the granite verge, with his head and shoulders over the dark, deserted street. Half swooning and sick with pain, he saw above him the other gargoyle, the claws of whose right foreleg were firmly embedded in his shoulder. They tore deeper, as if with a dreadful clenching. The monster seemed to tower like some fabulous beast above its prey, and he felt himself slipping dizzily across the cathedral gutter, with the gargoyle twisting and turning as if to resume its normal position over the gulf. Its slow, inexorable movement seemed to be part of his vertigo. The very tower was tilting and revolving beneath him in some unnatural nightmare fashion. Dimly, in a daze of fear and agony, Reynard saw the remorseless tiger face bending toward him with its horrid teeth laid bare in an eternal rictus of diabolic hate. Somehow, he had retained a hammer. With an instinctive impulse to defend himself, he struck at the gargoyle, whose cruel features seemed to approach him like something seen in the ultimate madness and distortion of delirium. Even as he struck, the vertiginous turning movement continued, and he felt the talons dragging him outward on empty air. In his cramped, recumbent position, the blow fell short of the hateful face and came down with a dull clangor on the foreleg, whose curving talons were fixed in his shoulder like meat hooks. The clangor ended in a sharp, cracking sound, and the leaning gargoyle vanished from Reynard's vision as he fell. He saw nothing more, except the dark mass of the cathedral tower that seemed to soar away from him and to rush upward unbelievably in the livid, starless heavens to which the belated sun had not yet risen. It was the Archbishop Ambrosius, on his way to early Mass, who found the shattered body of Reynard lying face downward in the square. Ambrosius crossed himself in startled horror at the sight. And then, when he saw the object that was still clinging to Reynard's shoulder, he repeated the gesture with a more than pious promptness. He bent down to examine the thing. With the infallible memory of a true art lover, he recognized it at once. Then, through the same clearness of recollection, he saw that the stone foreleg, whose claws were so deeply buried in Reynard's flesh, had somehow undergone a most unnatural alteration. The paw, as he remembered it, should have been slightly bent and relaxed, but now it was stiffly outthrust and elongated, as if, like the paw of a living limb, it had reached for something, or had dragged a heavy burden with its ferine talons.